Hello, class. I am picking up from where we ended our lecture on Tuesday, looking at a painting by Gauguin called The Yellow Christ from 1889. We've been talking about the primary artist associated with the title Post-Impressionism and taking a deep dive into some of their paintings and talking about each one of their distinct styles and ways of working with color, brushstroke, and composition, mostly in contradistinction to Impressionism, which had a very different approach to some of those issues, and also the post-impressionist interest in content or meaningfulness in works of art, and how they were attempting to infuse that into their compositions as well. So far, we've looked at Seurat, Toulouse-Lautrec, Van Gogh, and today we will primarily be talking about the paintings of Gauguin, and probably with some time, at least to start with Cezanne, and then continue that sometime later after spring break. So as we ended class on Tuesday, we were looking at the Yellow Christ, and we had put this in the context of Gauguin's interrelationship with Van Gogh at the Studio of the South, that was as it was called, in the south of France, where the two artists were working together, talking to each other, and developing each of their own unique language of painting. And after the conflict, let's call it the conflict, Gauguin had gone back up to Brittany, the northern coast of France, to immerse himself again in this primitive, as he saw it, primitive culture of the peasants, and to make a number of paintings up there. And so the Yellow Christ is a result of that second trip to Breton. And as you can see, also very much influenced by, we believe, some of the color work that he was seeing in Van Gogh's paintings, particularly the yellow. We talked about that, for example, when we looked at and talked about Van Gogh's use of blue and yellow kind of consistently in a number of his paintings. And I mentioned in passing the sunflowers, and I wanted to bring in a slide that features several of these. There are at least 7 or 8 known versions of sunflowers painted by Van Gogh. And you can see his interest in this color, yellow, the relationship between the yellows of the flowers versus a yellow in the background and a yellow on the table, versus the yellows in contradistinctions to blues. And we talked a lot about Van Gogh's interest in color relationship and color contrasts, and also his use of texture on his surfaces. Well, here with Gauguin, we see also a use of yellow. Here the yellow, too, is to communicate to us the supernatural, spiritual, mystical content of the picture, in that the Breton peasants are having a vision. They are literally, in a sense, seeing Christ, but that means symbolically they are having an elevated spiritual experience. The rest of life normally goes on behind them, at least to the degree that we're seeing the rural French countryside of someone walking on a path, and we see the fields and all kind of normal Breton life behind this main event in the front. But this main event is the meaningfulness of the picture. And here we are to get a feel for the otherworldly kind of spiritual vision that these women are having, and that Gauguin has painted for us in this vivid yellow crucifixion scene in the foreground. You can see he believed it to be an important painting in his overall development, too, because on the right you see one of his self-portraits in which the Yellow Christ painting features prominently behind him. This also, and we talked a bit about this in class on Tuesday, is a good example of this style called cloisonnism, or like cloisonné, in that we have a strong outline around the forms, and then within the forms, a solid, strong body of color. Like cloisonné enamel, we use this term to talk about particularly Gauguin's style and his followers, who use an outline around forms and then fill in with color. That is, of course, very different than what Van Gogh, for example, would do, or what Seurat would do. But again, within post-impressionism, we allow this kind of difference in terms of painting styles. I had also shown you, as an example of Gauguin style, this portrait of Vincent van Gogh, and we had talked about the color that he is using here and his kind of flattening and his development of this idea of kind of abstract places within the pictorial realm. And Gauguin is going to go further this direction. And I also talked a little bit here about the difference in the texture of Gauguin's painting versus Van Gogh's. We spent a lot of time talking about Van Gogh's brushwork, the intensity of it, the thickness of it, the variety of strokes that he uses, how he builds up a painting surface with brushstrokes. Gauguin's surfaces are very different, and I found a detail that may help you see this. They are much flatter, so the paint is much thinner in a Gauguin. He's thinned it out considerably. In fact, it's often so thin, as you can see here, that you're getting the texture of the canvas poking up through the paint. Now, Van Gogh would give us blank canvas, but on the next inch, there would be a huge glob of paint standing right next to it. Gauguin's overall are very matte, very thin color application with this strong outline. And again, this is a distinction that Gauguin is developing in terms of his own way of making paintings. Here are a couple from this post-portrait studio in the South period with Van Gogh, a couple more of Van Gogh's works, Gauguin's works as he's developing his style. One of the things he becomes interested in is ceramics, and he is making ceramic objects. He will also make wood carvings, and so sometimes when you go to a museum and you walk into the Gauguin post-impressionist room, you will find objects because Gauguin gets interested in this. What we're seeing is one of his self-portraits now in a mug, in a ceramic, on the left, and on the right, another self-portrait painted. You notice here, Gauguin, lots of self-portraits, and we talked about that with Van Gogh too. Part of the interest in terms of Van Gogh's production, of course, is there's the history of this in Dutch painting, this tradition of making multiple self-portraits, Rembrandt probably being the most relevant example. But you see here Gauguin doing a number of self-portraits too. Well, why? Well, part of this has to do with this idea of putting individual expressive content into a painting. So your individuality, the way you see the world, what's important to you, that becomes viable content in a post-impressionist painting world. And so Gauguin is going to make a number of images that are about him, his experiences, how he sees the world, how he sees himself, and that becomes a critical part of his post-impressionist kind of painting. Also, what you see here are this tendencies I'll talk about in Gauguin to get ever more abstract. It's a fascinating picture. We have both the strong red and the strong yellow, and we have seen that in Gauguin's work before, Vision After the Sermon, for example, and of course we also have seen that in Van Gogh's work in terms of, for example, the Night Cafe. So here we see Gauguin doing this, kind of bisecting this canvas almost in half, but interestingly, this curve up here, a very strong continuous red field, down here a very strong continuous yellow field. We recognize him, and then we have a little halo and some apples. This seems to be a kind of distant reference to religious symbolism, this idea of good and evil, Adam and Eve, and the snake also is present in the image, as you see down here. And then also we have these weird forms like this, very abstract kind of plant-like form. Is this the tree? Is this the tree in the Garden of Good and Evil? Probably something like that. But notice how Gauguin has detached some of those symbols and kind of deployed them here in his own canvas. Is it about Adam and Eve? Is it about Genesis? No, so probably not so much that, but more about Gauguin's own understanding of himself as a human being, both good and evil, conflicted within. These kinds of elements that we're seeing here, the snake, the apples, the halo, these are the sorts of things that lend people to use the term symbolism in Gauguin's painting as well. Now, use this as an adjective here. He's using symbolic elements within his paintings, and the symbolic elements bring meaning with them. They have a context and a tradition of meaningfulness. And so when Gauguin takes them, for example, here out of religious history and reuses them here, he's bringing something of their meaning and reactivating it within his own composition. This is the symbolic move of Gauguin. A little later, in a few weeks, we'll talk about a movement that's called symbolism with a capital S. What we're seeing here are some of the first seeds of that. And so this practice on the part of Gauguin, especially, and his followers, will be picked up by subsequent painters. And we'll talk about that. But here we're seeing just the beginning of it. And again, understand this as another aspect or characteristic under the broad umbrella of post-impressionism. So Gauguin spends a little bit of time here back at the in northern France, kind of recovering after this incident and event, spending time with Van Gogh, and then he makes his first trip to Tahiti, 1891, and does a number of pictures that will span at least 2 visits, separated by some years. What he would do is gather as much money as he could from selling his work, beg, borrowing, and stealing money from people he knows, and then gathering enough to go on a long trip, and then he'll go away for a couple of years, and then once he runs out of money, he'll come back to Paris and kind of start the fundraising thing over again, and then go back again to the South Pacific. And so it becomes a pattern later in his life. Of course, Tahiti is a French colony, and so it's fairly easy for him as a European to go there. He makes contacts with the ruling colonial authorities and is fairly comfortable there in the sense that he is the European colonial power coming to visit. He goes, of course, because he already is interested in this idea of getting away from civilization, getting away from Paris, the city, the modern city, that place of the Impressionists, getting away from the bourgeois lifestyle, getting away from the obligations and responsibilities of his marriage and his many children. And so for him, it's an escape away from that into what he calls the primitive, a less civilized, more intense kind of life. And of course, we saw him first try to find that up in Brittany. And then we see him now even going to a further extreme by taking himself out to the South Pacific and to Tahiti. Now, what we're looking at here is one of the pictures that were made on that trip, that first trip. You'll notice that he uses Tahitian language to title these pictures, and then we then translate it out in the subtitle. We have a landscape in which we have a native man who is busy, looks like chopping wood or doing something. We have some women back here around what looks like some kind of hut or some kind of domestic structure. In the front, we have some exotic birds. And of course, he's interested in the vegetation, such as palm trees, etc. All of this in a kind of intense patchwork of color, greens, orange, a hot orange, really burnt orange, reds, yellows, a little bit of vivid blue, a nice swath of yellow down here on the bottom, which allows a space for the title and his signature. One of the things I want you to see, of course, is how flat this is, and I bring in now a very familiar picture by Manet of the Déjeuner sous l'herbe, and this, I would say, of course, is even flatter, and with using some of the same techniques in terms of running things off the tops and the edges, which we're familiar with, by changing proportions and scales, by using here very large flat areas of singular color. It almost looks like a patchwork or a quilt, right? A design, a very abstract design on the surface. Now, in terms of content, of course, it's still this exotic, interesting landscape to Gauguin, but overall, the pictorial space and the imagery connotes a kind of flatness and decorative pattern. This is the general direction Gauguin's going to go in. Here we have 2 pictures. This one is probably one of the most famous that comes out of his Tahitian period, The Spirit of the Dead Watching. Let me move that. I think that's I'm trying to take a distraction out of the text. There we go. Where we have Spirit of the Dead Watching on the left. And I'm showing you a slightly earlier picture that was done up in the Breton countryside, Loss of Virginity. Here again, we see the symbolist elements very clearly. So this young woman on the right, virginity is symbolized by her nude, young, pale, white body. And then the loss of that virginity is connoted by this animal. So it looks like something like a fox or something like this, right? And so this idea of the kind of the primitive force of sexuality symbolized by this animal. Again, it's odd because this body is kind of splayed out against the Breton countryside inexplicably. Of course, it's not real, right? Again, this is an imaginary thing. We have the Breton peasants back here on the path, but this young lady is kind of separated out from them, and this is sort of a metaphor, an image that evokes this idea of the pure state of virginity and then the loss of that. Gauguin's done something similar here on the left, where we're now again using the young woman's body as a kind of vehicle for symbolism. In this case, a young Tahitian woman. And Gauguin, once he was there, very quickly established a relationship with these young Tahitian women. And this one is, we would use the word mistress perhaps, although that makes it sound more civilized than it probably actually was in terms of his power over her and his ability to make her a part of his household. Very young, a teenager basically. And Gauguin, the story Gauguin tells us that he came home one night to the hut and found her prone here on the bed, absolutely terrified. She was having anxiety, fear over the fear of ghosts, and that the ghost is, in Gauguin's mind, symbolized by this figure back here on the lower or the upper left corner. We see her and her frightened expression here, and then there's these sort of sparks, these strange phosphorescent sparks. And let me go a little closer. You can see here that for Gauguin are meant to be this kind of frisson of a kind of supernatural presence coming into the space and it's kind of sparking. And she, in the evening, it's kind of this interesting dark purpley pink color scheme. And she is, of course, contrasted, her skin against the white of the bed sheet, and then surrounded by all of this dark color. It makes this a very dramatic, powerful kind of composition. Gauguin is picking up the pattern of the Tahitian textiles here on the bed under and around her. I hope when you look at this, and most people did, we were reminded of Manet's Olympia, except that this is Gauguin's kind of Tahitian redo of that idea of the prone female nude, a modern version of it. Yeah, of course, but Manet's modern version of it is very political and culturally modern. Gauguin's version of it is a kind of imaginary Tahitian, exotic, erotic dream that he's having, and that he's projecting much of that onto this picture. He will go on to make a number of images featuring these Tahitian women. I mean, clearly they're available to him as models. They have exotic looks from Gauguin's point of view. He, of course, as we've seen, is paying attention to the textiles as well, in terms of also how the women dress in traditional costume. And so here we have two young Tahitian women on the beach. And we have those two figures, which are fairly clearly rendered. And then what's really fascinating about this picture is this extraordinary area up here in this upper corner. Very abstract. I think we're supposed to read it as like a shoreline. Is that a river behind them, probably? And that we're seeing reflections of vegetation on that water. But of course, Gauguin has rendered this in colors that he absolutely has chosen. And we're familiar with this, with Gauguin, this idea that I don't have to make things the color they actually are. And so in this case, he has made a pink beach and put a lot of really strong tomato red color and bright blue out in that upper left corner, which I'm assuming is something like water. And so kind of free reign in terms of how you work with color. And the color and the pattern here to communicate this idea of the exotic, extraordinary, the difference in the way he sees the world when he's transported to this different place with an intensity of sunlight and warmth, and that changes his mode of perception, in a sense, how he sees the world. Here's perhaps one of the best known of these Tahitian pictures, The Day of the God.